Good morning, Air Mobility Heroes. It's great speaking with you today from Washington, D.C., although I would much rather be with you in person, wherever you are. As I look out across the virtual audience, I can imagine everybody is listening to me very intently. This event has a phenomenal lineup of keynote speakers, and I'm honored to be included among them, representing over 70,000 reserve citizen airmen, many of whom work in the air mobility mission set alongside their active duty and guard counterparts. I'd like to thank General McNabb and the Airlift Tanker Association for inviting me to speak at your annual conference this year. The theme of this year's big event is Big Data, Artificial Intelligence, and the Roaring '20s version 2.0. I don't know about anybody else, but after this first year in 2020, the Roaring '20s version 2.0, man, I hope they fix some of these bugs and get out version 2.1 as soon as possible. I want to start today by talking about the Air Force Reserve, specifically our mobility airmen. When I last spoke to this forum 2 years ago, I said the only missions that we don't do as reservists are sitting in ICBM silos and flying the U-2. Since that time, we've had reservists integrate into both of those mission sets. So now, reservists are in every single mission, same as our active component counterparts. We produce combat power for America, period. We do that through strategic depth in the national defense, and we do that through operational support to our joint force. We're a cost-effective force, providing 20% of the Air Force's operational and strategic capability on just 3% of the Air Force budget. We're able to do this because we're predominantly a part-time force. Approximately 75% of our airmen serve in a part-time capacity, with the majority of our part-time force maintaining operational readiness on only 39 training days a year. The other 25% are full-time in one confusing status or another. The Air Force Reserve has 12 core functions. Rapid global mobility is the second largest of these functions. Agile combat support is just slightly larger. Approximately 1/3 of our personnel are air mobility. About 25% of all air mobility personnel are in the reserves. Approximately 41% are in the active component, and the other 34% are in the guard. At the end of the day, Air Force Reserve Command provides cost-effective strategic depth for the nation with airmen that possess a depth of mission experience and the ability to leverage their diverse civilian experiences. That's what we do. The Air Force regularly flies every single cargo and tanker aircraft in the inventory. We also operate the HC-130, which is technically a search and rescue platform, but since it's capable of air refueling, I'm including it with the tankers. In September of this year, the Air Force Reserve accepted the second 2 KC-46 aircraft at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, supporting a unit-equipped mission there. That brings the current total of 4 aircraft at the command's 916th Air Refueling Wing. The KC-46 is a perfect example of what the Air Force Reserve contributes to the total force team. That aircraft is based on the Boeing 767, which the airlines have been flying for decades. And you know who flies for the airlines, and you know who maintains their jets? It's the Air Force Reserve Airmen. Reservists use their combined civilian and military expertise to make the KC-46 better from the start. They helped with the FAA certifications, they assisted with the development of aircrew training and maintenance programs, and they provided input to a bunch of working groups, improving things like cockpit design and the avionics, which are amazing. Then they flew it during testing. The air crews that conducted the KC-46 flight tests at Edwards Air Force Base were a mix of active duty and reserve personnel who flew together as a total force team. And as a total force team, we're also enhancing the rapid global mobility mission set by bringing the KC-46 online at the same time as our active component counterparts. One of the best parts of this job is that I get to lead mobility reserve citizen airmen who help take care of Americans, who incidentally are my favorite people. I also like our allies, but I draw the line there. Taking care of Americans is one of the top priorities that the Command Chief, Tim White, and I laid out at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the past 6 months, this crisis has created new challenges and opportunities for the Air Force Reserve. When the pandemic began, we were clear that taking care of Americans, taking care of airmen, and taking care of their families was our top priority. When the nation needed us to care for our fellow Americans, we activated over 1,700 reserve citizen airmen in support of the COVID-19 operational response. Within 48 hours of receiving the request, our staff sent medical personnel to the points of greatest need in New York City and New Jersey. Our airlift forces were integral to transporting personal protective equipment, testing kits, and ventilators, saving countless lives. The lessons that our medical reserve citizen airmen learned on the front lines of the pandemic were then brought home to each of their communities, strengthening our national response. But it wasn't just our medical personnel going to the point of greatest need during the pandemic. As our medical personnel answered the call, so did our air crews. This photo is from April, when Major Brian Metzger, with his crew, Major Bond, Captain Meter, and Technical Sergeant Joey Burnett, flew a C-130 with medical personnel from Dobbins Air Reserve Base to Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst in New Jersey. On the way, the air crew made stops at Patrick and MacDill Air Force Bases in Florida and Charleston Air Force Base in South Carolina to pick up more reserve citizen airmen to aid in the fight against COVID-19. I got to tell you, in the Air Force Reserve, we've been doing ride sharing long before Uber did. Aside from the pandemic, most of the people in this room have seen at least 3 of our unique mission sets in action over the past few months. The Air Reserve component maintains weather reconnaissance, large area aerial spraying, and aerial firefighting capabilities within the Department of Defense. This Atlantic hurricane season has been the most active on record. In August, the hurricane hunters of the 403rd Wing conducted dispersed operations from Charleston Air Force Base when Hurricane Laura and Tropical Storm Marco threatened their primary base of operations at Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi. In September, they went through a similar series of operations with Hurricanes Sally and Paulette flying from Ellington Air Force Base in Texas. The data that they provide helps our mission partners at NOAA make more accurate forecasts, and that saves American lives all across our country. In the aftermath of a hurricane, clouds of mosquitoes are so thick that they endanger cattle and horses. When this threatens the lives and property of our fellow Americans, our large area aerial spraying capability is there to respond. The 910th Airlift Wing out of Youngstown, Ohio, has been integral to our assistance in hurricane recovery operations as it maintains the Department of Defense's only large area fixed wing aerial spray capability. In 2018, in the wake of Hurricane Michael, the 910th flew 91 aerial spray sorties to provide vital insect control at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, while the installation and its airmen began recovering from that horrific hurricane. 2020 has also brought 3 of the 4 largest wildfires in California history, making our aerial firefighting mission even more critical. In September, reserve citizen airmen assigned to the 302nd Airlift Wing out of Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado mobilized to stand shoulder to shoulder with our Air National Guard counterparts and other mission partners to make sure that we were fighting wildfires that were raging across the western United States. Each of these capabilities the Air Reserve component brings, whether it's weather reconnaissance, large area aerial spraying, and firefighting, is about one thing. It's about taking care of our fellow Americans, because that's what the Guard and Reserve do. We surge to relieve human suffering and protect Americans. I'm telling you, taking care of those in need, it's in your DNA as mobility crews. I may use the word hero to describe you frequently, but I do not use it lightly. 72 years ago, an Allied air mobility team flew over 2 million tons of supplies to West Berlin, which had been cut off by the Soviets. Their efforts kept that city alive for nearly a year. It ultimately led to the Soviets abandoning that blockade. Since then, air mobility has responded to many crises, large and small, man-made and natural. Even as we speak, air mobility heroes are saving lives. While I was speaking of the Berlin airlift, I'd be remiss if I didn't wish Colonel Gale Hal Halverson, also known as the Candy Bomber, a belated happy 100th birthday. Led by his inherent kindness, he and his crew started dropping candy to the children of Berlin. They made parachutes out of silk handkerchiefs, and Hal and his crew started making regular drops. That was amazing. When I talk about the future, I talk about the need for resilient leaders. They're airmen who can take smart risks and employ air power for strategic effect, like Hal did. It's also the need to have leaders at all levels that can see the value of innovation, that can nurture and help scale those ideas, those game-changing ideas, into reality. One of the first air power theorists was also a mustache aficionado named Duhay. The quote on this slide is from a century ago, but is still relevant today. as a joint force and as a total force. Much like those air power pioneers a century ago, we find ourselves at a technological inflection point. In the 1920s, many things that we take for granted as part of our everyday lives were just emerging. The first working television was invented in 1925. Penicillin was discovered in 1928. Robert Goddard flight tested his first liquid-fueled rocket in 1926. The first movies with soundtracks and dialogue were produced by Warner Brothers during that era. Of course, I remember it well, because I am old. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Charles Lindbergh's first ever nonstop transatlantic flight that was made in 1927, because at that time, he too was a reservist, but probably in a civilian capacity. Much like these technological advances that happened a century ago, big data and artificial intelligence continue to revolutionize industries and economies across our globe. Big data enables companies to precisely target potential customers and with advertisements that are tailored to their preferences. While artificial intelligence is already capable of driving cars and flying unmanned aircraft with more disruptions on the horizon, that's one thing that we have to be ready for. And how does that translate into a competitive advantage for the U.S. and its allies? When we look at the future as an extension of today, we can see a world where these lessons of the 1920s are going to apply. It wouldn't be a speech by Rich Scobee if I didn't at least give you one digression into talking about achievements of a great fighter pilot. But bear with me just for a minute. The interwar years were a time of tight budgets, but exceptional creativity. Sound familiar? It's what we're looking at right now. During that time, the pioneers of the Army Air Service and later the Army Air Corps spent a lot of time thinking about the role of air power in the next war, and they laid the intellectual foundation for the United States Air Force. Among them was General Claire Chennault. When I say that name, most people think about his exploits with the Flying Tigers in China. His official Air Force biography even uses the word legendary hero to describe him. One of the things that enabled the Flying Tigers to be effective was the superior command and control enabled by an indigenous early warning network. By having trained advanced spotters throughout the countryside, the Flying Tigers were able to sufficiently warn their fighter pilots to take off and climb to an altitude where they could either press with advantage to the enemy or at least get away from where that fight was occurring in their P-40 Warhawks. But this wasn't all on the spot innovation. General Chennault didn't make this up on the go. Before he got to the AOR, he'd gone through this when he looked at what was going on at Luke Field in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii from 1923 to 1926. As he began to look at the operating environment and gauge the shift in the geopolitical environment, he began experimenting with command and control techniques. He bristled against the conventional wisdom that coastal artillery would be able to defend the islands against both naval and aerial attacks. He began experimenting with having spotters on top of water towers to provide alerts. Much like General Dowding during the Battle of Britain, he intuitively understood the value of command and control for harnessing air power. In our own time, we stand in a similar era. The prospect of state-on-state conflict was unthinkable, but preparation for it is now a priority. And at the same time, new technologies such as big data and artificial intelligence are going to permanently change warfare. We face a high-end, data-informed fight, and it's going to be in a degraded environment. The old road we knew well of how we employ air power is not going to work in the future. It'll be blocked. The Chief of Staff's paper, Accelerating Change or Lose, is an acknowledgement of the fact that we must change rapidly and significantly if we're going to meet our national defense obligations. Much like the airmen who came before us a century ago, we have to think our way through complex problems across warfighting domains. Joint all-domain command and control is absolutely essential going forward to enable real-time mission management. One of the most memorable stories that the chief told during his speech at AFA was about his children playing soccer. He talked about going to a soccer complex and making sure they got on the right field at the right time to compete. That story really captures what we're getting after. As leaders, we're trying to make sure that we are able to get our forces to the right place at the right time so that they can compete decisively within that battle space. I want to end on a hopeful note. This quote from Billy Mitchell is a lot like me, and it hasn't aged well. In spite of that, he keyed in on an important point. People make air power happen. In the 1920s, Army Air Corps Reserve pilots struggled to maintain their proficiency. They only got about 10 flying hours per year. And they were working with old World War I era airplanes that were rapidly deteriorating. Often, military aerodromes were closed on the weekends, making it impossible for pilots to train on a regular basis. We've learned that lesson. When a reserve citizen airman goes in for training, she is on the same equipment as her active component counterparts. And when the nation needs us, she seamlessly integrates with her active component counterparts. We deliver combat power for America because we recruit and retain the best people that our country has to offer. In conclusion, which I know are the two sweetest words in any speech, we've covered a lot of ground over the past few minutes. And I want you to know we face a future that is defined by rapid change, both as a service and as a nation. Some of the conventional wisdom that has shaped the way in which we employ air power has been challenged. However, we only need to look back at our history to see a way forward. We can look back to the Roaring '20s, the interwar years in which we laid a strong intellectual foundation for how we would compete in the future. We can see that line of continuity as the theorists like Duhay and Mitchell laid it out to practitioners like Chenault. We can draw inspiration from innovators from our history like Hal Halvorson. Each of you is a part of that ongoing story. As mobility airmen, you carry on a tradition from the hump to Berlin to El Dorado Canyon and everywhere in between. You are the people part of the equation that makes air power possible. So on behalf of the more than 70,000 reserve citizen airmen that I am so fortunate to lead with our command chief, I cannot tell you how proud I am to serve with each of you. Thank you for everything you do.